early American belief on government was that the best form of government was the least government. The Progressive era politics changed this belief when political corruption started to become more and more common. There are three main forms of political corruption. The first is the direct exchange of personal money for favors. This is the only form that is illegal and is also the most rare. The second is campaign spending and donation in exchange for favors. An example of this is when people spend millions to prevent politicians from winning. The final form is the exchange for favors now and payment later. The president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, responded to this political corruption by making government more prominent in the regulation of the economy and by giving people direct access to the legislative process. The governor of Wisconsin and later Senator Robert Law Follett was incredibly influential during the Progressive era on the regulation of economy and direct primary. Follett wanted to end corruption in the political campaigns and government. At the time, political campaigns were highly influenced by money and still are today. Follett also thought that people should have a say in the selection of candidates to run in the election. He wanted legislature to pass a law that required parties to hold direct primary. This meant that all party members voted for candidates to run in the election instead of the party bosses. In order to force the legislature to listen to the voters, the initiative, referendum, and recall acts were created. The goal of these acts was to engage ordinary citizens in participatory democracy. An initiative is when the citizen draft a proposed law, and there are two forms of this, direct and indirect initiative. Direct initiative is when citizens draft a proposed law and then it goes to the ballot. Indirect initiative is when citizens draft a proposed law and then it goes to the legislature. A referendum is the practice of letting voters accept or reject measures proposed by the legislature. Recall is the right to enable voters to remove unsatisfactory elected officials from the office. An example of an initiative that was passed in Oregon was Measure 5 in November of 1990. Measure 5 changed Oregon's property tax and public schools funding systems. Once Measure 5 was passed, it transformed the funding of Oregon's public school system to make it primarily dependent on state general revenues controlled by legislature rather than on local school boards. Measure 5 brought up a few big factors. This measure brought a lot of inconsistency to school districts and general voter ignorance of the school voting system. There was an acceleration of housing values and property taxes in the Portland metropolitan area. The measure also was not supposed to harm public schools, and it could improve rural schools by forcing the state to spread out income tax money collected from wealthier parts of Oregon, but this did not happen. Measure 5 was passed because the state had to make up all the revenue lost through the property tax reduction. But the problem with this is the taxes supplied the majority of school funding, and now things were having to be cut. By November 1990, voters could not ignore any of the raising property taxes and instability of public school funding. It has been 25 years since Measure 5 initiative, and there is still a challenge in the Oregon public school funding. The political corruption that came up with the Measure 5 was that the impact of the measure wasn't immediate and uniform across Oregon. For example, in Pendleton, not much happened. Another example from Oregon was Measure 36. Measure 36 was on the ballot in 2004, and this measure put a ban on same-sex marriage and only recognized marriage between a man and a woman. In 2014, the measure was overturned, however, and the law was considered unconstitutional. This made Oregon only the seventh state to allow same-sex marriage. Then, on June 26, 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex couples had a constitutional right to get married in all 50 states.
Follett not only wanted to help the politicians and government system, he also wanted to stop the corruption in industries, specifically the railroad. The rapid growing industries were not economically regulated, so huge industries like the railroad were able to set their own prices. To solve this issue, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Commission Act. This act regulated the rates and services of companies such as buses, trucking, water carriers, expedited delivery services, and oil pipelines. In the Supreme Court ruling in 1877 in the case Munn v. Illinois, it was decided that only the U.S. Congress could regulate interstate commerce. The Interstate Commerce Commission started out ineffective in the 1890s because it did not have any of the resources it needed to enforce the act. The law that created it failed to give the right enforcement laws, so it faced some trouble in the beginning. Once the Interstate Commerce Act started to gain power, the legislature allowed the Interstate Commerce Commissioners to make rates. it became more effective because of the power it gained over time. During the Progressive Era, a huge part of the corruption was related to political machines. Political machines were informal political groups, and their goal was to gain and keep power through illegal means. One of the most famous political machines was Tammany Hall in New York City. Their popularity came from their willingness to help the poor and immigrants in New York. Though Tammany Hall was very popular with the lower classes, privileged people were also attracted to the political machine because they saw power. A party boss ran the political machine and had the job of getting votes, doing political marches, providing necessities, and controlling city finances. Tammany Hall had many bosses. One of the most famous bosses was William Boss Tweed. When Boss Tweed took control of Tammany Hall, corruption spread rapidly. The corruption was known as the Tweed Ring. The Tweed Ring spread across almost all the public of New York City by embezzling funds from places such as hospitals and charities. After the Tweed Ring had gained power in New York City, they began taking New York City's money by creating fake leases and vouchers. The amount of damage that the Tweed Ring did almost ended up bankrupting New York City. Some historians say it was almost $2 million. Political machines defined the rapidly growing industrial America with their power stretching across the country. When America started to wake up and fight back against the corruption, several steps were taken to remove their influence. One of these was the 17th Amendment. Originally, 2 senators from each state served 6-year terms and were chosen by the state legislators. The original method failed in 2 ways. The first being greedy political machines would take control of the legislators and use it for their own gains. The second problem was if 2 different parties controlled the legislature, when the time came to choose new senators, the legislators would argue for years without coming to an agreement on who would be the senator, which would leave that state without one for that time. The 17th Amendment was created to counter these 2 problems and was one of the many ways progressives tried to change the Constitution and make America's government more democratic. The amendment made it so that citizens of the state were the ones to choose the senator, each citizen equaling 1 vote. Though Tammany was filled with corruption, not everyone that came out of Tammany was corrupt. Tammany Hall helped turn the Democratic Party into what is the modern Democratic Party today. Today, the Democratic Party is very open to diversity, much like how Tammany Hall was accepting of the poor and immigrants. Graft is a way of getting money through honest or dishonest means, and was seen in Tammany Hall. The first type of graft is honest graft. Honest graft is when someone sees an opportunity and takes it. Honest graft helps with personal gain by using inside information. Honest graft also pursues the public's interest and one's personal interest at the same time. George Washington Plunkett popularized this, and he was the one who said, "I have seen my opportunities and took them." George Washington Plunkett describes an example of this by saying, he goes to a neighborhood and buys all the land, and then once there is a rush for land, they will have to buy it from him, where he will be able to raise the prices and make a good profit off of his investment. Tammany Hall was also an example of honest graft. Dishonest graft is any kind of stealing, bribery, and much more. This was popularized by William Boss Tweed. Multiple politicians were accused of robbing the city, but really they were making profit off of the honest graft. During the Progressive Era, journalists known as muckrakers wrote articles and books exposing the political corruption and monopolistic corruptions. They wrote about companies like the Standard Oil Company and meat packaging companies. Both of these companies were abusing their power of either their buyers or their workers. The Standard Oil Company was setting unfair prices for the farmers to pay in order to transport their crops, and the meat packaging companies gave their employees unsanitary working conditions. They also exposed the giant political machine, Tammany Hall, for its corruption. Corruption levels are different depending on its area because some areas are more profitable than others. One modern example of this is Estonia. Estonia had an idea to make trade free, and by doing this, there was no point in officials taking bribes on imports and exports since it can be done for free. Rules like this decrease the level of corruption. The size of the city also makes an impact as the political machines and others looking for money want to make as much as possible. Larger cities such as New York tend to generate more money than smaller cities, so usually where the money is, the more problems arise. Political corruption is a never-ending issue, and there are always new cases. One recent example of political corruption happened in New York on July 1st, 2015. Leader of the New York State Senate, Malcolm Smith, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for bribery. The New York Times stated that Smith had a corrupt democratic process. Smith was sentenced to prison for consenting to the payment of tens of thousands of dollars to the Republican Party leaders to permit him as a registered Queens Democrat. However, Smith denied that he was greedy for power and said that he did it so he could help others as mayor. Another corruption scandal happened in the U.S. Navy. Navy Commander Mario Herrera was accused of illegally assisting the owner of GDMA, or Glen Defense Marine Asia, in obtaining Navy procurement contracts. Herrera gave the owner classified information and in return received vacations, services of prostitutes, and gifts which included boxes of steaks worth $1,800,000.
The civil service reform is a movement that improved the way how people should be elected to office, rules of conduct, and much more. It was fueled by the growing demand on government and the extreme problem of corruption. The demands on government grew a lot, so Congress established a short-lived United States Civil Service Commission. The civil service reform established that the position of the people were given within the federal government should be awarded by the merit system, which is the process of promoting and hiring government employees based on their ability to perform a job rather than on their political connection. This was a way to help limit the political corruption in the government. President Rutherford B. Hayes launched a voluntary civil service procedure, which was then funded by the reformers and got support from President James Garfield. Then, in 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Act, which established the Permanent Civil Service Commission. The election of 1884 was between New York's Democratic Governor, Grover Cleveland, and former Republican Senator James G. Blaine. The election all boiled down to New York, in which Cleveland won because of 1,047 votes, making it the second closest election right after the election of 2000. During this time, the Republicans had the power, but they abused it. They copied many tactics used by political tyrants. They mocked the Constitution and challenged the integrity of votes. This election was incredibly important because Cleveland was the first Democratic president in 24 years. That was the equivalent of 6 elections. This showed how the power of the parties shifted from the Republicans to the Democrats' favor. Politics, however, cannot always fix social problems, and one example of this is the 18th Amendment. This banned alcohol in the United States that was not for religious or medical purposes. This was meant to help society, since alcohol was blamed by many women and men at the time for misfortunes inside the American household. The act, meant to better society, only enraged it, and was the only amendment in United States history to be repealed. It would be very hard today for politics to make a reform to address a social problem. The reason why is because there are so many people in the United States, all with different ideas and opinions, as seen in the newest election of 2016. Donald Trump had 45.9% of the popular vote, and his rival Hillary Clinton had 48%. This shows how even though Donald Trump won, he did not receive the popular vote, and thus whatever move he does that is towards the right will most likely be hated by the Democrats who lean towards the left. One example of a political reform that did help fix a social problem was the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment created an income tax. This helped solve the unequal distribution of wealth problems. Income taxes are taxes based on how much money you make. There are many different types to organize the government within a city, but no form of organization is perfect. Each city, depending on their size and population, will flourish under a different form of government. There are three main types of organized city government, those being mayor-council form, council-manager form, and commission form. Mayor-council form is one of two of the most common ways of government within the United States of America. The form itself is most commonly found in large cities where the citizens elect a mayor and a council to govern over the city. This type of government has two different forms with similar yet different outcomes, those being the weak mayors and those being the strong mayors. The weak mayors only have power within the city council, but still lack power to veto what the council passes and to either add or remove officials. This is beneficial because one cannot abuse power as a weak mayor, but at the same time, one cannot do much to get things done. The strong mayors, however, have an executive branch and have the power to veto, add and remove officials without the notice of anyone else, and control the budget of the city. Usually, they will appoint a city manager to supervise and oversee the departments and council. This is the more powerful side of the mayor, as he has total control. So having a good and productive mayor can benefit the city and all citizens in their life quality. This power, however, is almost unchecked by anyone. So having a corrupt mayor like some of the party bosses in the 1880s would not be uncommon or helpful to the cities. These corrupt mayors can utterly control a city under their thumb without suffering consequences. Council manager form is the second of the two most common ways of government within the United States of America. Council manager form is governing a city with the use of a council, which deems the direction the city would take to move forward. This is better in smaller cities, as the council does not have one man over the other, and so no one can control everything. But if two parties are together on the council and start bickering, then the council could stop progression of the city completely in its tracks. Commission form is rarely used, but is a small commission of usually 5 to 7 people who are elected to govern over the local city. They are elected through block voting and have the important job of completely running the city, similar to a council. A mayor might be elected, but only out of honor as he has no benefits whatsoever. This way, similar to the council manager way, allows it so that no man has total control over the city. But because it is so small and the power is so distributed, there is almost no leadership in this form, and there can be deadlocks between the members, which could end the productivity of the city completely. The goal of the Progressive Era was to improve society and was a time of a series of responses to problems. These were problems in American society that came from the growth of industry. Although the Progressive Era was an era of change, the movement towards equality did not help everyone. Sadly, many minority groups were ignored by Progressive Era politicians. The Chinese were not allowed to immigrate to the United States. African Americans were not allowed to join the Union, and the Japanese were eliminated from the United States' workforce. In addition of the rapidly growing radical discrimination, the Progressive Era also failed to help religious discrimination.